Hello, everyone. This is Bridgette Adu-Wadier from Theogony, the Student Journalism Media Organization at TC Williams High School. And right now, you're joining me from my bedroom. And welcome to another episode of Behind the Headlines, home edition during this pandemic. And this pandemic has not stopped us from having our journalism talk shows with three journalists that I'm going to introduce to you right now. We have Denise Dunbar, looking very elegant with her protective gear. We have Michael Pope, and we have Vernon Miles. And these three journalists from local organizations are joining me today to discuss how the city is adapting during this pandemic. And the first topic on our list is the local businesses. Obviously, local businesses have been through really hard trials and lots of challenges. A lot of businesses have been closing or just been ordering online for a lot of citizens, and a lot of them have been losing money. I was wondering, Denise, what you think the upside to all of this online ordering and online management of businesses might bring to the community.
Well, I think it's causing a lot of businesses to embrace a different use of technology in different ways than they have before. And I think that in the long run, assuming that they survive this time away, it may actually help them change their businesses and adapt to sort of changing times in a constructive way. I know at our newspaper, the fact that, and we'll talk about this in a different context later, but the fact that we've learned how to do production remotely, and that this crisis has driven a whole lot more traffic to our webpage than previously. When people go there to read our daily updates, and then while they're there, they're reading a lot of other things. We're trying to have a number of related stories every week. So I can speak from our own experience that we're definitely going to try to build on this. And we're still, the Alexandria Times is always going to be print first, but we're definitely going to be more proactive with our online presence moving forward. And I think some of the restaurants in particular may find that this opens new avenues for them.
What's your take on this, Michael? Personally, I've seen the mayor tweeting his favorite local restaurants, such as the Lost Dog Cafe, and really encouraging the public to support their local businesses. So do you think people might have a renewed appreciation for the local restaurants and such?
I think definitely, there's no doubt about it. People are really focused on restaurants, but restaurants clearly are in trouble. But of all the businesses that are having hard times right now, they're not the ones that are most hard hit, because you can still go to a restaurant and get takeout or carry out. The ones that are really hurting are the ones that had to close their doors and they just can't do anything at all. All the retail shops, the gift stores, the nail salons, the place where I get my hair cut, those are places that their doors are closed and they cannot do any kind of takeout and delivery. And those are businesses that have now applied for all this federal money through the Paycheck Protection Program. And I was following up on some of this as it's been developing. And just in the past couple of days, the numbers came out on that. More than 40,000 businesses in Virginia were approved for this federal money under the Paycheck Protection Program. That's $9 billion in Virginia. And the cool thing about this particular program is, unlike most disaster loans that you're supposed to pay back as a loan, this is what's called a forgivable loan. So if you can prove to the bank and to the federal government that you have kept all your employees, then you don't have to pay the money back, which is good because most disaster loans are actually never paid back anyway. If you look at the list of all the federal disaster loans that have been granted here in Alexandria, most of them were never paid back in full. So this program is actually designed so that you don't have to pay them back in full. And I think those loans actually are now in the first wave of those loans, or forgivable loans, are now in the process of being closed. And so we'll see this money start flowing in Alexandria very soon.
Yeah, and then as for you, Vernon, Alexandria is pretty well known for being this thriving area of local businesses everywhere, especially in Old Town. Do you think that's going to be the same after this pandemic starts to die down?
Well, I think one of my biggest concerns in terms of the local retail and local business market is going to be whether the kind of experiential focus on that industry and on that retail goes away. For the last couple of years, we've heard that as kind of a big alternative to like Amazon and online shopping, is that local stores should kind of lean in on offering an experience. And as we've seen, with the last few months of this pandemic, I think that really came back to bite a couple of these companies in ways that they could not have expected. So I don't think that'll stick around too long. I think we'll recover from that and be back to wanting that experience, particularly after everybody's been cooped up inside. But I'm a little worried that that might hurt some of the diversity as people start playing it safe after this, looking back on all the businesses that have closed, all of the businesses that have really suffered, like the local bookstores, the local like yarn store, fiber space. And, I'm worried there won't be as much interest in doing something new.
A couple weeks ago, the city budget officials have sort of revamped and reformed their budget for the next fiscal year and slashed about $50 million from everything that they plan to do. They really had to basically go back to the drawing board. And I want to know, what did you think of that, Vernon, and what implications that might have for the city?
Well, I think it's going to have very serious implications looking down the road. The operating budget gets a lot of the focus, but I think the CIP is where we're going to see a lot of that. The city, I think, is doing a pretty good job of recognizing that they can't afford to slash and burn too much. During the recession, there was this idea that they don't have to keep up with infrastructure, that stuff like that could be pushed back, and that, that was one of the first things to go when they were like, what cuts can we make? And I think this time around, they're really focusing on, we want to make sure we get the roads paved. We want to make sure we keep up with the essential services, and that we can't fall too far behind on these capital projects, some of which will only get more expensive as time goes on. So I think so far I've been pretty impressed with what I've seen on the capital side of the budget. That's with regards to keeping some things intact as necessary, but also making cuts where you have to. It'll be interesting to see how that impacts the T.C. Williams expansion, since that was one of the biggest items that got cut or pushed back.
Yeah, and you, Michael, actually interviewed the mayor about the city's plans to adapt with the pandemic, and the city mayor had some issues with the budget officials cutting the capital improvement program so much, and he said that the city had done a similar thing back in the 2008 recession, and he felt like it really put the city behind. What was your take on that, and what was it like talking to the mayor?
Well, yeah, I asked the mayor what he felt like the biggest mistake the city made during the last recession. So Justin Wilson and Del Pepper are the lone survivors from that era that are still in the city council. And so I was curious if, if the mayor had any lessons learned from that time period in terms of how the city had responded to that recession. And he brought this issue up of capital spending. He felt like the city put the pause on too much of their capital program, and that became a problem because if you postpone a lot of this stuff, then maintenance ends up becoming more expensive and construction costs go up. And so he felt like the city made a mistake in delaying and postponing all these capital projects from more than a decade ago. And in retrospect, that was a problem, and that moving forward, they should avoid doing that. The trap, of course, is, okay, so you want to move forward with the capital program. How are you going to do that? How are you possibly going to balance the books? And so I think this budget they're now looking at tries to strike that balance a little bit, because it keeps that MacArthur project going with the swing space, and that's still moving forward, but they're putting the T.C. Williams project on hold. And so I think they've tried to thread that needle as best they could.
So I have a slightly different take on this. I thought the initial budget was outrageously high, and I thought that the tax increase was pretty outrageous. So Bridgette, I don't know if you saw, but in Mark Jinks's, the city manager's original budget, the tax bill for the average homeowner in Alexandria was going to increase by 6.8% over their tax bill last year. And the rate of inflation is about a third that. So the tax increase, that the hit that the local residents were going to take was through, 3 times the size of the rate of inflation. And you're asking about sort of hearing from people and people being able to react. we've gotten a ton of letters at the Alexandria Times that I actually wound up not printing hardly any of them because they sort of got overtaken by events. But people were outraged over this tax increase. And it's just a lot in 1 year. And it's interesting because the city manager has actually been in his job exactly 5 years. It was 5 years last week was his anniversary. Happy anniversary, Mr. Jinks. And his background is as a crafter of budgets. He's actually really good at that. He did that for the city of Alexandria for 10 years before he became deputy city manager, before he became city manager. And he's really been very good for a long time at finding money in different places, at balancing the budget. But I personally felt like this year's budget was really out of line. And so, ironically, I actually think it's more in line now. And I know that does mean delaying some things, but the fact that some things like MacArthur are moving forward, I think it's a good budget, what we wound up with.
That's interesting.
Yeah, especially since the 2% tax increase on properties is now being scrapped. And I'm sure a lot of homeowners are sort of relieved now that the economy isn't working for them and there is that financial strain.
Well, yes and no. So the biggest part of the 6.8% increase actually came from rising assessments, and property assessments were conducted before this pandemic. So clearly property values have gone down since the assessments were done, and they're not redoing the assessments. So the tax bills are actually still going up significantly. The decline in the city's revenue is going to be from retail and restaurant taxes and hotel taxes. They're actually, the deficit would be much, much worse, ironically, if they weren't already still doing a significant tax increase simply because of the assessments. But you're right, it's not as bad as it would have been because they are doing away with the extra 2-cent increase.
The city really kind of lucked out here in terms of the timing because all these property values were sort of locked into place before the emergency happened. And so, I mean, you could make the case that, they could go back and redo them. I'm not really sure that property assessments would change as a result of I guess if you're thinking about on the current real estate market, no one's buying, but I mean, would that really change the value of the home all that much? I mean, that's also where the city gets a huge chunk of its money is the residential property tax revenue they get. The other big chunk of it is this thing that's really taken a hit, which is all the restaurants and the retail and the B-pole and
hotel.
Hotel, transit occupancy taxes, whatever they're called. So the city is really going to be taking a revenue hit. And if they wanted to also provide additional tax relief, one thing they could have done that they did not do is lower the tax rate. So they took this tax rate increase and said, we're not going to do that. They took that off the table. Let's keep the same. They decided to keep the same tax rate.
Well, it's been a long time since we talked about the Seminary Road issue, but it's kind of a funny little joke there in the new budget. The complete street stuff got kind of axed for now. So, that's funny that was for a year, like the big talk of town and the big argument and discussion, and now it kind of quietly disappeared in the new budget.
Vernon, you mentioned that a big thing that this budget is going to impact is the high school project and how that's going to proceed. And I'm curious to see if the school board has revealed any plans with how they're going to proceed with that. I talked to Helen Lloyd, and she said that the communications manager of the school division, and she said that things would proceed as they were going to before the pandemic, except that the funding is going to be delayed until the fiscal year 2023. And that's our segue into virtual schools and distance learning and how these students are adapting. And
great segue, Bridgette.
Excellent.
Yeah, and I know very well that this has been a huge, adapting opportunity for me specifically. I've talked to a lot of students who said that they have more work now than they did when they were in school. And I'm thinking, Vernon, how do you think this is going to impact education in Alexandria, given that, we're a city that, our superintendent focuses so much on equity and trying to maintain equitable opportunity. But right now that students aren't at home, that's kind of being scrapped right now.
It is difficult. My girlfriend is actually a teacher, so every morning I've gotten to hear her interacting with her class, and I've gotten to really appreciate the kind of behind the scenes of watching a teacher struggle to like try to make sure she's connecting with her students. Meanwhile, also trying to balance some of the like administrative academic issues. So that's an incredibly frustrating thing for everybody in the school system, from teachers on up to like principals and school administration. It's really difficult, and there's no we talk about businesses and we talk about the way that can like improve, and it's really hard to see any kind of like positive, light, happy part of this for schools. One thing I will say is that we have seen teachers like Mr. Elias, I don't know if I'm saying his last name correctly, but we have seen teachers in T.C. Williams High School and other schools across the system do really interesting, exciting new things with technology with their students that, I think they have a lot more leeway to do now that the schools don't really have any other option. So they've done things like the morning program that in the International Academy, that's like a school-wide show. There's been things like a teacher who has hosted a like science talk roundtable with different career professionals who she brings in to talk to her class. So it's been pretty interesting to see the way some teachers really adapt. And I think teachers of the older grade levels have sort of an advantage there.
One thing that I think is really interesting is the disparity between what happened in Fairfax County versus what happened in Alexandria. In Fairfax County, that was like a top-down approach where the school system tried to use this program called Blackboard, and they spent 4 weeks planning this rollout, and it was a disaster. And when they finally rolled it out, people couldn't log in. And then there was all this sort of trolling that happened with racist remarks and all kinds of horrible things. And they had to shut the whole thing down again. And that was after 4 weeks of planning. So in Alexandria, it worked totally the other way around, which is as one teacher explained to me, it was kind of like guerrilla warfare. Grab whatever weapons available to you and start shooting. So they were using Zoom, and they were using something called Canvas, and so the rollout in Alexandria was way more successful than Fairfax County, which is, a lot of teachers totally get sick of hearing about how great Fairfax County is, and Fairfax County should be a model and everyone should follow it. So I think there was a little bit of schadenfreude actually at the failure of Fairfax County to make this happen. Whereas in Alexandria, it was by comparison very successful.
Denise, I don't know if you have any differing perspectives, as you often do, about many things about education.
I don't know if that's a compliment or not, but
yes, it was totally.
Denise is happy kids aren't in school.
So my kids are older. I have 2 kids in college, and I would say that they are working at least as hard as they would have been in school. It seems to me that I have several thoughts. Number one, are you a senior, Bridgette?
I'm a junior.
You're a junior, okay. I think I really feel so sorry for the kids who are seniors in particular. I mean, I think missing any part of your high school or college experience is a real loss. But I think especially for the seniors in both places, I mean, you can have a graduation ceremony later or whatever, but, these rites of passage just aren't going to happen for these kids. And, I mean, in the grand scheme of things, people are dying. It's not the biggest thing in the world. And yet it is a real loss for these kids. And I think that, that's like one thing that should be acknowledged. I think as far as learning within Alexandria, it seems to me our administration and the teachers have been handled it really well. I think the rollout has gone really well. I think that the biggest gap in learning with this isn't as much high school or maybe even middle school, it's the elementary school level, in my opinion, where it's harder to do these kind of things remotely. I think particularly I think that the families are going to have to be really, really involved and really engaged for elementary students to not fall behind because of this. And it's kind of harder to grab a 7 or 8-year-old and make them plop down and do this if they're not physically in school. I think that the good side of that is they have plenty of time to catch up. And the most important thing is that people get through this. I mean, I think that there are a lot of things that you just have to sort of say, yeah, that's a significant thing. But the main thing is just we've got to get through this, and you've got to be safe, and you've got to come out on the other side.
This online learning experience is definitely going to be transformative for everybody, but especially the younger students who learn those foundational skills. And that is the end of our discussion. Thank you to all three of you for taking time out of your quarantine to do this with me. And that is this episode of Behind the Headlines, Home Edition. And remember to wash your hands and stay safe. And don't forget to wear your masks like these three people are doing. Bye!